You did not need to be convinced. You only needed to hear it often enough. During the Cold War, propaganda was not loud persuasion. It was quiet repetition. It did not demand belief. It demanded familiarity. Truth was not replaced outright. It was slowly surrounded, framed, and narrowed until alternatives felt distant, unreliable, or unnecessary. From the outside, propaganda is often imagined as crude slogans and exaggerated imagery. From the inside, it felt far more subtle. It entered daily life through routine language, trusted institutions, and repeated narratives that appeared reasonable because they were constant. The goal was not to lie blatantly, but to define what felt normal. Propaganda functioned best when it did not feel imposed. When messages arrived through schools, newspapers, radio, and everyday conversation, they blended into the background of life. People did not experience propaganda as instruction. They experienced it as environment. Over time, that environment shaped perception more effectively than force ever could. The Cold War was fought not only over territory or ideology, but over interpretation. What events meant mattered as much as what happened. Victories were framed. Failures were contextualized. Contradictions were absorbed into larger narratives that preserved coherence. The world was explained continuously, leaving little room for alternative explanations to gain traction. This constant explanation produced stability, but it also produced limitation. When narratives repeat without challenge, they define the boundaries of acceptable thought. People learn not only what to believe, but what not to question. Propaganda did not need to silence everyone. It needed to guide attention away from certain questions consistently. Importantly, propaganda did not operate only in authoritarian systems. Democratic societies also relied on narrative management. The methods differed, but the objective was similar: maintain cohesion, justify policy, and frame uncertainty in ways that preserved legitimacy. The Cold War normalized this practice across systems that claimed to oppose each other. As a result, reality itself became contested terrain. Events did not speak for themselves. They were interpreted immediately, packaged for consumption, and delivered with context that shaped understanding before reflection could occur. The speed of explanation mattered. Delay created doubt. Repetition created confidence. For ordinary people, this environment shaped how information was consumed. Trust gravitated toward familiar sources. Skepticism focused on outsiders. Consistency became a signal of reliability, even when accuracy was incomplete. Over time, people stopped asking whether narratives were true and began asking whether they were credible. This shift was subtle but profound. Credibility replaced truth as the primary measure of acceptance. A message did not need to be correct. It needed to align with expectation. Propaganda succeeded when it felt predictable, and predictability, once internalized, becomes difficult to challenge. This is how the Cold War was experienced daily, not as a battle for belief, but as a competition to define what reality felt like. Once predictability became the measure of credibility, propaganda no longer needed to persuade actively. It needed only to maintain presence. Messages did not have to be compelling. They had to be consistent. Over time, familiarity produced comfort, and comfort discouraged scrutiny. What felt normal was rarely questioned. This environment reshaped how people processed information. New ideas were evaluated, not on their merits, but on how well they fit within existing narratives. Information that aligned with expectations felt trustworthy. Information that disrupted them felt suspicious. The reaction was often emotional before it was analytical. Propaganda worked by shaping instinct rather than argument. Institutions played a crucial role in reinforcing this effect. Schools transmitted approved frameworks of interpretation. Media repeated official language. Cultural production echoed dominant themes. Each element reinforced the others, creating a closed loop of meaning. Contradictions were not eliminated. They were absorbed and reframed. Reframing was essential. When events challenged established narratives, explanations adjusted. Context expanded. Responsibility shifted. The goal was not to deny reality entirely, but to render it manageable. Discomfort was addressed not by truth, but by coherence. A coherent story felt safer than an accurate but destabilizing one. This reliance on coherence encouraged selective attention. Certain facts were emphasized repeatedly, while others faded from visibility. Silence became as important as speech. What was omitted shaped perception as powerfully as what was stated. Over time, absence itself became normalized. Language evolved accordingly. Terms acquired specific connotations. Labels simplified complex realities. Moral clarity was manufactured through repetition. Once language stabilized, thought followed. People learned which words signaled alignment and which invited scrutiny. Vocabulary became a boundary. This boundary was rarely enforced overtly. Social reinforcement did the work. Deviating from accepted language attracted discomfort rather than punishment. Isolation rather than repression corrected behavior. Propaganda succeeded because it harnessed social dynamics, not because it imposed them directly. The result was an information environment that appeared pluralistic, but operated within narrow limits. Debate existed, but it unfolded inside predefined parameters. Questions were permitted, but answers were guided. Disagreement was allowed, but only within acceptable range. The illusion of openness preserved legitimacy while maintaining control. Importantly, individuals were not passive recipients of this environment. They participated in it. Repeating narratives reinforced them. Sharing approved interpretations signaled belonging. The act of alignment provided social safety. Over time, participation felt voluntary, even when alternatives were constrained. This participation created a feedback loop. The more people echoed dominant narratives, the more those narratives appeared validated. Consensus was manufactured not through force but through visibility. What was repeated most often felt most real. The Cold War amplified this dynamic because uncertainty was constant. Fear of the unknown encouraged reliance on familiar explanations. Propaganda did not eliminate fear. It managed it. It provided narratives that made anxiety tolerable by framing it as purposeful or necessary. In this way, propaganda functioned as emotional infrastructure. It stabilized perception during prolonged tension. It prevented paralysis by offering interpretation. The cost was reduced complexity. Nuance became expendable. Simplification preserved clarity. This simplification did not require uniform belief. It required shared reference points. People could disagree privately, but public discourse remained structured. Reality became a shared script rather than a shared understanding. And once reality is scripted, deviation feels less like discovery and more like disruption. As propaganda settled into daily life, it began to shape not only what people believed, but how they evaluated belief itself. Skepticism did not disappear. It was redirected. Doubt focused outward rather than inward. Alternative narratives were questioned more harshly than familiar ones. Trust became asymmetric. This asymmetry created a powerful filtering mechanism. Information arriving from outside the accepted framework was subjected to scrutiny, while information originating within it passed more easily. The source mattered more than the content. Credibility was inherited rather than earned. Over time, this dynamic reduced the need for censorship. People filtered themselves. The Cold War intensified this process because it framed the world as divided and adversarial. Competing narratives were not presented as alternative interpretations, but as threats. Disagreement was not simply error. It was risk. Propaganda exploited this framing by linking belief to security. Accepting the wrong narrative could feel dangerous. Fear reinforced conformity subtly. Not fear of punishment alone, but fear of misalignment. Being out of step with the dominant interpretation created social discomfort. Individuals adjusted preemptively to avoid isolation. The need to belong guided perception as much as evidence did. This social dimension was critical. Propaganda did not operate solely through state channels. It relied on everyday repetition by ordinary people. Conversations, jokes, assumptions, and shared references carried narratives forward. The system worked best when authority spoke least and society spoke most. Over time, repetition blurred the boundary between message and memory. Narratives embedded themselves into personal experience. Events were remembered not as they were encountered, but as they were later explained. Interpretation retroactively reshaped recollection. Memory became a product of narrative reinforcement. This effect was especially strong during prolonged tension. When uncertainty lasted years or decades, narratives provided continuity. They explained why sacrifices were necessary, why fear persisted, and why change was dangerous. Propaganda offered meaning where resolution was absent. Meaning once internalized, stabilized identity. People understood themselves through the lens of the narrative. Loyalty became part of self-definition. Questioning the narrative risked questioning oneself. This psychological barrier proved more effective than coercion. Importantly, propaganda did not always require falsehood. Selective truth often worked better. Accurate facts were arranged into interpretations that favored certain conclusions. context-guided perception. By controlling framing rather than content, propaganda maintained plausibility. This plausibility sustained legitimacy. Systems did not collapse under disbelief because disbelief was fragmented. Individuals doubted privately, but public alignment persisted. The appearance of consensus remained intact. Silence filled the gap between belief and expression. As a result, reality became layered. There was the official version, the socially acceptable version, and the privately held version. These layers coexisted without resolution. Managing them required cognitive effort, but it became routine. The Cold War normalized this layering across societies. Citizens learned to navigate multiple realities simultaneously. Adaptation replaced confrontation. Survival depended on understanding which version of reality belonged where. This normalization carried forward even as conditions changed. Once learned, narrative navigation does not easily disappear. People continue to rely on familiar frameworks even after their original context fades. Propaganda leaves residue, and that residue reshapes how societies process information long after the conflict that produced it has ended. As this layered reality became routine, propaganda achieved one of its most effective outcomes. It stopped feeling external. Messages no longer appeared as something imposed by authority. They felt organic, familiar, and self-evident. When narratives become internalized this deeply, they no longer need constant reinforcement. They sustain themselves. This self-sustaining quality altered how people related to information over time. Instead of asking whether a claim was accurate, individuals asked whether it fit the world as they understood it. Compatibility replaced verification. A statement that aligned with expectation felt true enough. One that did not felt suspect regardless of evidence. This shift made correction difficult. Challenging a narrative was not merely a factual disagreement. It was a disruption of coherence. Coherence provided psychological stability in an environment defined by uncertainty and threat. To question it was to reopen anxiety that propaganda had helped manage. Institutions reinforced this stability by emphasizing continuity. Historical interpretation was streamlined. Complex events were reduced to clear moral arcs. Ambiguity was minimized. The past was explained in ways that supported the present. Once established, these explanations were repeated until they felt timeless. Education systems played a central role in this process. Students were not only taught information, they were taught frameworks. These frameworks shaped how new information would be interpreted later in life. Once learned, they guided perception automatically, reducing the need for conscious evaluation. Cultural production extended this effect. Films, literature, and public art echoed dominant themes. Even when critical, they operated within accepted boundaries. Dissent was permitted as long as it remained legible within the overarching narrative. This created the impression of openness while preserving structural control. The Cold War environment amplified these dynamics because external pressure never fully disappeared. The presence of an opposing system justified narrative discipline. Alternative interpretations could always be framed as hostile, naive, or dangerous. Propaganda relied on contrast as much as repetition. Defining the other clarified the self. Over time, this contrast simplified identity. Complex societies were reduced to moral categories. Nuance became optional. Simplification made the world easier to navigate emotionally, even if it reduced understanding. Propaganda thrived not by eliminating intelligence but by offering clarity where complexity felt overwhelming. This clarity was comforting. It provided orientation. It told people where they stood, who they trusted, and what they feared. In prolonged conflict, orientation mattered more than accuracy. Knowing how to feel was often more important than knowing what was true. The cost of this orientation became apparent only gradually. As narratives hardened, adaptability declined. New information struggled to find space within established frameworks. Change required reinterpretation of deeply held assumptions. Resistance emerged not because people were ignorant, but because coherence was threatened. This resistance was not always conscious. It appeared as instinctive dismissal, discomfort, or disbelief. Propaganda had trained perception to protect itself. Contradictory information triggered defense rather than curiosity. The system preserved itself by shaping emotional response. By the later stages of the Cold War, propaganda no longer needed to dominate every channel. Its most important work had already been done. It had shaped how reality was filtered. The remaining task was maintenance, not expansion. Reality had become something to be managed, not discovered. And when reality is managed long enough, the ability to recognize manipulation weakens, not because people stop thinking, but because thinking follows familiar paths. As familiar paths of thought solidified, propaganda's most enduring effect became evident. It reshaped intuition. People no longer needed to consciously recall official narratives to respond to events. Reactions emerged automatically. Interpretations felt immediate. The line between personal judgment and learned framing blurred until it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. This intuitive alignment reduced cognitive effort. In a world saturated with information and uncertainty, having ready-made interpretations was efficient. Propaganda succeeded by offering mental shortcuts. It simplified complexity into recognizable patterns. These patterns saved time, reduced anxiety, and preserved emotional equilibrium during prolonged tension. However, this efficiency came at a cost. Mental shortcuts discourage exploration. When answers feel obvious, questions feel unnecessary. Curiosity weakens not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer rewarded. The unfamiliar becomes uncomfortable. The familiar feels sufficient. The Cold War relied heavily on this dynamic. Constant threat made simplicity appealing. Clear distinctions between good and bad, safe and dangerous, us and them reduced psychological strain. Propaganda did not invent fear. It organized it. By giving fear structure, it made it manageable. This organization shaped moral perception. Actions were evaluated less on their substance and more on their alignment with narrative. Identical behaviors were judged differently depending on who performed them. Consistency mattered less than loyalty. Moral reasoning adapted to narrative boundaries. Over time, this adaptation normalized contradiction. People accepted explanations that would otherwise feel inconsistent. Discomfort was resolved through framing rather than examination. The narrative absorbed tension, allowing belief to remain intact without requiring coherence at every point. This tolerance for contradiction strengthened propaganda's resilience. Systems did not collapse under exposure, because exposure alone did not dismantle frameworks. Information that conflicted with established narratives was reinterpreted rather than rejected outright. It was folded into existing explanations or dismissed as anomaly. Social reinforcement continued to play a central role. Public agreement signaled safety. Repetition signaled reliability. Silence signaled caution. Individuals learned to read these signals instinctively. Alignment became a social skill rather than an ideological commitment. Importantly, this process was not always experienced as manipulation. Many felt informed, engaged, and rational. Propaganda rarely presents itself as coercion. It presents itself as common sense. When narratives feel reasonable, their origin becomes irrelevant. This sense of reasonableness insulated propaganda from critique. Challenging it required sustained effort and willingness to endure discomfort. Few environments encouraged such effort consistently. The cost of questioning often outweighed the perceived benefit. Stability, even if constructed, felt preferable to uncertainty. As the Cold War progressed, propaganda increasingly focused on maintenance rather than persuasion. The foundational narratives were already in place. The task was to preserve them against erosion. Reinforcement replaced expansion. Familiarity replaced urgency. This maintenance mode explains why propaganda often appeared dull rather than dramatic. It did not need spectacle. It needed repetition. Ordinary language, routine broadcasts, and predictable framing kept narratives alive without drawing attention to themselves. In this way, propaganda became background noise, constant, unobtrusive, and effective. It shaped perception not by overwhelming it, but by surrounding it. The absence of alternatives felt natural because alternatives were rarely encountered in credible form. And when perception is shaped by environment rather than instruction, control becomes difficult to recognize, because it feels like understanding. As propaganda settled into this role of background influence, its most subtle function became normalization. What was repeated long enough stopped being perceived as messaging and began to feel like description. Narratives no longer argued for a version of reality. They simply described what reality supposedly was. This distinction mattered. Description feels neutral. Argument feels intentional. By presenting interpretations as obvious facts, propaganda removed itself from scrutiny. People did not feel persuaded. They felt informed. This sense of being informed reinforced confidence, even when information was incomplete or selectively framed. The illusion of clarity replaced the pursuit of understanding. Normalization also affected emotional response. Certain reactions became expected. Others felt inappropriate. Tragedies were framed as necessary sacrifices. Successes were framed as proof of correctness. Ambivalence had little space. Emotional range narrowed in parallel with narrative range. This narrowing reduced friction. When expectations align, conflict decreases. Propaganda contributed to social stability by synchronizing perception. People reacted similarly to events, reducing unpredictability. Shared interpretation became a form of coordination. Coordination mattered deeply in the Cold War context. Prolonged tension required societies to function under stress without constant disruption. Propaganda provided emotional regulation. It explained why fear persisted, why compromise was dangerous, and why patience was virtuous. The narrative did not eliminate anxiety. It gave anxiety purpose. Purpose transformed endurance into virtue. Sacrifice became meaningful. Inconvenience became temporary. Doubt became irresponsible. Propaganda reframed hardship as contribution. This reframing sustained morale without demanding enthusiasm. Acceptance was enough. The cost of this emotional regulation emerged slowly. When narratives define acceptable feeling, personal experience becomes secondary. Individuals learn to adjust their reactions to fit expectation. Over time, the gap between lived experience and expressed emotion widens. Authentic response retreats inward. This retreat weakens feedback loops. Institutions receive fewer honest signals about conditions on the ground. Problems are masked by narrative consistency. Adjustment becomes delayed. Systems respond to perception rather than reality. Propaganda stabilizes, but it also insulates. Insulation is effective in the short term. In the long term, it accumulates distortion. Decisions are made based on managed understanding. Surprises become more likely. When reality eventually intrudes, it does so abruptly, because it has not been integrated gradually. The Cold War experienced this tension repeatedly. Moments of crisis exposed the limits of narrative management. Events that could not be easily framed created shock. The need to respond quickly revealed how dependent systems had become on controlled interpretation. Yet even these moments did not dismantle propaganda structures. They were adapted. Explanations evolved. Narratives expanded. Failure was reframed as resilience. The system absorbed contradiction and continued. This adaptability was propaganda's greatest strength. It did not rely on static messages. It relied on flexible framing. As long as coherence could be restored, belief could persist. The narrative did not need to be perfect. It needed to be survivable. Over time, this survival became institutionalized. Organizations, media, and education systems learned how to respond instinctively to disruption. Reflex replaced reflection. Messaging preceded understanding. Speed became essential. Speed mattered because it prevented uncertainty from spreading. In the absence of immediate explanation, people filled gaps with speculation. Propaganda aimed to occupy that space first. Whoever framed events earliest shaped perception most effectively. This race to explain intensified the importance of narrative readiness. Interpretations were prepared in advance. Templates existed for crisis, success, and failure. Reality was processed through pre-existing categories before it was fully understood. And once reality is filtered through prepared narratives, the distinction between explanation and control becomes increasingly difficult to see. As narrative readiness became institutional habit, propaganda began to shape not only reaction, but anticipation. Societies learned to expect certain explanations before events even unfolded. This expectation reduced uncertainty, but it also narrowed imagination. If outcomes were already framed, alternatives felt implausible. This anticipation affected how people interpreted warning signs. Signals that aligned with established narratives were amplified. Signals that contradicted them were minimized or dismissed. The framework determined relevance. Attention followed expectation. Reality was filtered before it could disrupt coherence. Over time, this filtering created blind spots. When systems are optimized for familiar patterns, they struggle to recognize unfamiliar ones. Propaganda did not merely shape belief, it shaped attention. What was noticed mattered as much as what was believed. The unseen became insignificant by default. This mattered deeply in the later stages of the Cold War. As conditions shifted, narratives lagged behind reality. Economic strain, social change, and technological transformation introduced variables that did not fit established explanations easily. The effort to preserve coherence increased. Authorities responded by doubling down on framing. Messaging intensified. Explanations grew more elaborate. The narrative became heavier, more defensive. The need to reassure increased as confidence declined. Stability required constant maintenance. For the public, this created a subtle tension. Official explanations felt familiar, but they felt less convincing. Repetition continued, but its effect weakened. The gap between lived experience and narrated reality widened. People did not immediately reject narratives. They quietly disengaged from them. This disengagement did not look like rebellion. It looked like indifference. Trust eroded not through confrontation, but through fatigue. When explanations feel obligatory rather than informative, attention drifts. Propaganda depends on engagement. Without it, repetition loses force. As engagement declined, informal interpretation networks grew. People relied more on personal observation, private conversation, and comparison. These sources lacked authority, but they felt immediate. Credibility shifted from institutional consistency to experiential resonance. This shift was gradual and uneven. Some remained aligned with official narratives. Others drifted quietly. The appearance of consensus persisted longer than the reality of it. Public discourse remained structured even as private belief diversified. The system struggled to detect this change because its indicators were performative. Attendance, compliance, and repetition continued. What changed was meaning. Participation no longer implied belief. Propaganda continued to circulate, but it circulated through a thinner layer of conviction. This thinning mattered. Propaganda is most effective when it feels unnecessary. When it becomes visible as effort, its authority weakens. The Cold War reached a point where narratives required reinforcement rather than assumption. That shift signaled vulnerability. Importantly, this vulnerability did not guarantee collapse. It introduced instability. Systems can persist with low legitimacy for long periods if alternatives remain unclear. Propaganda does not need full belief. It needs absence of organized doubt. Yet organized doubt does not emerge suddenly. It develops through shared recognition that narratives no longer explain experience adequately. Once people sense this gap collectively, coherence begins to fracture. In the later Cold War, this fracture did not explode. It spread quietly. Explanations were still offered, but they were received with reserve. The emotional bond between narrative and identity loosened. Loyalty became procedural rather than personal. This procedural loyalty maintained order, but it lacked resilience. When pressure increased, the system could not rely on belief to absorb shock. It relied only on habit. Habit sustains routine, not transformation. And when transformation becomes unavoidable, systems built on narrative control face a difficult choice: adapt their understanding of reality or attempt to preserve it against change. When the Cold War began to lose its structural clarity, propaganda did not disappear. It adjusted. Narratives softened, shifted emphasis, and reframed purpose. What changed was not the presence of interpretation, but its certainty. The confidence that once surrounded official explanations weakened. Reality became harder to manage as a single story. This moment revealed the true nature of propaganda's power. It had never depended solely on authority. It depended on alignment between institutions, language, expectation, and identity. When that alignment fractured, control did not collapse instantly. It thinned. Messages continued, but they no longer carried the same weight. The most revealing aspect of this transition was how quietly it occurred. There was no clear signal marking the end of narrative dominance. Instead, people noticed small inconsistencies. Explanations felt delayed. Language felt rehearsed. The gap between message and experience widened just enough to be felt, not yet challenged. For many, this produced caution rather than confrontation. Habit persisted. Compliance remained. But belief became conditional. Narratives were consumed with distance. Trust shifted from assumption to evaluation. Propaganda still functioned, but it no longer defined reality completely. This gradual shift underscores an essential truth. Propaganda is strongest when it feels invisible. Once it becomes noticeable, it must work harder to sustain itself. The effort required to maintain coherence increases as belief erodes. Control becomes maintenance rather than confidence. The legacy of Cold War propaganda did not end with the conflict itself. Its techniques, assumptions, and structures carried forward. Modern societies inherited systems designed to manage perception under uncertainty. The tools changed, but the logic remained familiar. repetition, framing, emotional regulation, and narrative readiness. Understanding this legacy requires moving beyond caricature. Propaganda was not merely deception imposed from above. It was a relationship between power and perception, sustained through participation, routine, and shared expectation. Ordinary people did not simply receive narratives. They lived within them. The Cold War demonstrates that controlling information is less effective than shaping interpretation. Facts matter, but context decides meaning. Reality is not replaced. It is organized. And once organized long enough, that structure feels natural. This is why propaganda remains relevant long after the Cold War ended. Not because the same messages persist, but because the same habits of interpretation remain. The inclination to trust familiar narratives, to avoid disruptive complexity, and to seek coherence over uncertainty continues to shape how societies understand the world. The lesson is not that truth is unreachable. It is that truth competes with comfort, and in periods of prolonged tension, comfort often wins. The Cold War was not only a conflict between systems, it was a long experiment in perception, and its most enduring result was not victory or defeat, but the realization that reality itself can be shaped without ever needing to be fully controlled.